Good evening. I want to welcome you all to tonight's forum on Iran and American foreign policy with our distinguished speakers, Flint Leverett, Hilary Mann Leverett, and Noam Chomsky. My name is Thea Keith Lucas. I am the coordinator of the Technology and Culture Forum here at MIT, and I hope you will check out some of our other events. I'm very pleased to be part of this event because it really goes to the heart of the Technology and Culture Forum's strengths and our history. The forum began in the 1950s when the Episcopal chaplain at the time, Myron Bloy, created a space for faculty members who were concerned about nuclear technology, which many of them had had a part in developing, and were concerned about how that technology was being used and how the world was teetering on the brink of war. So since the 1950s, the Episcopal Church and MIT have had this partnership to create a space where different views can come together to discuss moral issues. We work together as we share a dream of a better world, and we're willing to look for new and unexpected ways to make that dream a reality. I'd like to introduce to you our moderator for tonight's discussion. Professor Ali Banu Azizi is Professor of Political Science at Boston College and Director of the Program in Islamic Civilization and Societies. After receiving his PhD from Yale University in 1968, he taught at Yale and the University of Southern California before joining the Boston College faculty. Since then, he has held visiting appointments at the University of Tehran, Princeton, Harvard, and Oxford University, and MIT. He served as founding editor of the Journal of Iranian Studies from 1968 to 1982, and he is a past president of the International Society for Iranian Studies and the Middle East Studies Association. Professor Banu Azizi is the author of numerous articles on society, culture, and politics in Iran and the Middle East, as well as the co-author of Social Classes, the State and Revolution in Iran. As an affiliate at the Center for International Studies here at MIT, he is a frequent contributor to discussions of Middle East policy and history here on campus, and we are so grateful for his leadership tonight. Professor Banu Azizi.
Thank you very much, Thea, for your very kind introduction. I'm delighted to have been assigned this role and indeed honored. We have a wonderfully timely program tonight and a very distinguished panel for informing us and enlightening us. Before introducing members of the panel, I would like to perhaps say a few words to put tonight's discussion in some sort of historical context. The relationship between the United States and Iran, which is the topic of our panel, is indeed a long-standing, a very complex relation. Over the past 2 centuries, since the two nations have had dealings with one another, we have seen in this relationship practically every aspect of international affairs, problems, contestations, near wars that have been part and parcel of this relationship. It began in the beginning of the 19th century, in 1829 or so, when American missionaries, Presbyterian missionaries for the first time, went to Iran. They established hospitals, schools, quite a number of schools that lasted throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. When we come to the beginnings of the 20th century, there was, as many of you know, a major revolution, a constitutional revolution that ultimately gave a constitution and a constitutional form of government to Iran in the first decade of the 20th century. And in that struggle for the constitution, for democracy, if you will, an American teacher, a missionary and a teacher, a young man in his mid-20s, Howard Baskerville, actually fought on the side of the revolutionaries, constitutional revolutionaries, and gave his life. He is considered by Iranians to be a martyr of that revolution, and his gravesite is a very revered place even today in the city of Tabriz. After the constitution became triumphant, then we have a very major man of enormous goodwill, Morgan Schuster, who served as advisor to the parliament of Iran. In effect, he became the Secretary of Treasury of the country, and for a short time, or within a short period of time, he was able to put the finances of the country in good working order. He was forced to withdraw, to resign, by pressures that came from the Russians and the British, who were the two major imperial powers at the time competing with another. The relationship continued for the next several decades, and in the minds of Iranians, the United States was always the distant, non-colonial, non-imperialist power, an innocent power, if you will, until we come to the Second World War, when the country was actually occupied by the Allies. And during the war, the United States, Great Britain, and Russia held a major conference, and Iran was viewed as the bridge of victory to take supplies from the southern shores, from the Persian Gulf area, to the Russians around the Axis power blockades. After the war, the relationship between Iran and the United States continued on a relatively normal basis. The US sent various missions to help Iran economically and some military missions. One important episode, which many people forget, is that at the end of the war in 1946, 45, 46, the Russians, or the Soviets at the time, refused to honor their pledge to leave the country. And it was the United States, at that time, President Truman, who pressed the Soviets to make good on their promise and to leave. He took the matter to the United Nations, and by most historical accounts, this was the first salvo of the Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union. And the Soviets ultimately withdrew. Their intention had been to set up a socialist republic in the northern part of Iran. Then we have a major bitter episode in 1953 that most people are cognizant of, and that was the CIA, British intelligence-sponsored coup d'etat that occurred in 1953 that brought down the popular government of Mohammad Mossadegh, the nationalist figure who had just nationalized the Iranian oil industry. For the next 25 years or so, the United States and Iran enjoyed a very special, a very close relationship. Those were the years of the last Pahlavi monarch, the Shah of Iran. And it was during that period that the US's image began to change. Well, it had already changed because of the intervention that the US had made back in 1953. And many people in Iran, particularly the nationalists, the pro-democracy forces, blamed the US for its support of the Shah. Then the revolution, of course. Now, the US came to actually live with the Iranian revolution. It began to seek ways of reestablishing relations, but the hostage crisis prevented all of that. And then, as you know, for 440 days, the image of Iran in the US, among the American public, was as negative an image as one can imagine. And the rest, of course, is well known to most of you and the subject of the panel tonight, an exploration of US-Iran relations during the Islamic Republican rule in the country, starting with the revolution of 1979 to the present. I won't get into that at all. Let me then try to give you an idea about how the panel is going to present the ideas this evening. We will have three distinguished speakers. They will each speak for about 15 minutes or so. That should leave us with about an hour of, I hope, what would be a very lively and vigorous Q&A and debate, if you will. And we will stop at 9 o'clock. And now let me say a few words about our distinguished speakers. The first speaker will be Hilary Mann Leverett. Ms. Leverett received her law degree from Harvard University and her BA from Brandeis. She also studied at the American University in Cairo and at Tel Aviv University. She served in American embassies across the Middle East, at the US mission, at the United Nations, on the State Department's policy planning staff, and as director for Iran, Afghanistan, the Persian Gulf affairs at the National Security Council. In that last capacity, she was one of a very small number of US diplomats authorized to negotiate with Iranian officials over Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda during the 2001-2003 period. Most other American officials were barred from having any contact whatsoever with their Iranian counterparts. Since leaving government, Ms. Leverett has taught at Yale and is currently a senior professional lecturer at the American University's School of International Service and a visiting scholar at Peking University's School of International Studies. She will be followed by Professor Flint Leverett, who served as a CIA senior analyst and then on the State Department's policy planning staff and as a National Security Council senior director for Middle Eastern affairs. He left the George W. Bush White House and government service altogether in 2003 because of disagreements about the Middle East policy and the conduct of the war of terror, or war on terror, I should say. Since then, Professor Leverett has been a visiting professor at MIT, at Yale, and is currently a professor of international affairs and law at Penn State and a visiting scholar at the Peking University's School of International Studies. The Leveretts have individually and jointly published extensively on international relations, politics, political economy of the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, and of course on US policy towards these critical regions. Their articles have appeared in both academic mainstream and mainstream journals and various other alternative media outlets. They have been featured in documentaries on Iran by PBS, BBC, and they have appeared on public affairs programs, not only in the United States, but across the world. Our third speaker is Professor Noam Chomsky. It would be presumptuous for me, or anyone for that matter, to attempt to introduce Professor Chomsky. I am deeply aware of that and very humbled by the task. Well, let me simply say a few words. Professor Chomsky received his PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania, and he joined the MIT faculty back in 1955. In 1976, he was appointed the Institute Professor in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy. Professor Chomsky's, I was going to say footprints, but that's not the right word. His impact has been felt in a number of different fields. In all of them, he is regarded as one of the most distinguished scholars of the 20th century and now into the 21st century. Those fields, as I think everyone knows and deeply appreciates, include linguistics, philosophy, intellectual history, contemporary issues, international affairs, and, needless to say, US foreign policy. Over the past 5 decades, Professor Chomsky has offered critical indictments of US foreign policy and military interventions. I might say that as an observer, as a witness to Professor Chomsky's career over the past several decades, I've personally been inspired by his work in the civil rights movement, in the anti-war movement in the 1960s, in the opposition to the Shah, the dissidents of which I myself was a member at the time, and in many, many other contexts. It's an honor for me to introduce Professor Chomsky and the Leveretts, Flint and Hillary this evening, and I will now ask Hillary Leverett to kick off our panel's discussion for tonight. Thank you.
Good evening. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Good evening. Before beginning tonight, I want to offer some thanks. Thanks to Reverend Thea Keith Lucas of the Technology and Culture Forum here at MIT, and to her colleagues for organizing this event for us. Flint and I are literally thrilled to take part here tonight. We also want to offer a special thanks to our moderator, and of course to Professor Noam Chomsky. We are grateful to Professor Chomsky, not just for appearing with us today, though we do thank him for that. We are deeply grateful to him for prodding us every step of the way through our intellectual journey. In his famous essay, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, published 46 years ago, Professor Chomsky pointed out, when we consider the responsibility of intellectuals, our basic concern must be their role in the creation and analysis of ideology. Since then, Professor Chomsky has been both fearless and it would seem tireless in rigorously scrutinizing the claims of intellectuals who, in the service of power, ascribe universal validity to what are, in fact, very particular interests. Above all, he has been unrelenting in his critique of what he sees as the fundamental political axiom of US foreign policy, namely that the United States has the right to extend its power and control without limit insofar as it is feasible. It is in this critical spirit that Flint and I come here tonight. Now, most of the liberal establishment, I would wager, would take issue with the basic premise of this evening's event, that the United States has gone wrong in its policy toward the Islamic Republic of Iran. For example, Vice President Biden told over 10,000 pro-Israel activists in Washington recently that the Obama administration has quote, left Iran more isolated than ever. And Vice President Biden said, this matters because, quote, God forbid, if we have to act, it is important that the rest of the world is with us. Of course, many non-libertarian Republicans are critical of President Obama's Iran policy, but not because they think trying to isolate Iran in anticipation of attacking it is bad, but because in their view, President Obama has been insufficiently zealous in doing this. We start tonight from a different premise, that the United States has, in fact, gone badly wrong in its policies toward the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Middle East more generally. That this is so becomes clear if you compare the relative positions of the United States and Iran in the Middle East today with where they were on the eve of 9/11 just over a decade ago. On the eve of 9/11, every government in the Middle East, every single one, was either reflexively pro-American, like the governments in Egypt and Turkey, in negotiations to effectively become pro-American, like Gaddafi's government in Libya and Assad's in Syria, or staunchly anti-Iranian, like Saddam Hussein's government in Iraq or the Taliban in Afghanistan. But today, because of elections, governments in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Lebanon, Palestine, Turkey, and Iraq are all no longer reflexively pro-American and anti-Iranian. They are all now pursuing at least independent foreign policies, which means they're much less enthusiastic about strategic cooperation with the United States and more open to the Islamic Republic of Iran. So how did this happen? It would be a serious mistake to see America's problems in the Middle East today as just idiosyncratic products of the George W. Bush administration. Rather, Americans' problems in the Middle East grow out of a much deeper source that precedes the George W. Bush administration, that cuts across Democratic and Republican party lines, and today warps President Obama's policies every bit as much as those of his predecessors. In our new book, Going to Tehran, Flint and I describe this as a U.S. determination to act as an imperial power in the Middle East. This determination is well rooted in the logic of modern American foreign policy. Since World War II, American political elites have seen dispositive strategic influence over the Middle East hydrocarbons, its oil and gas, as essential to American ambitions for global primacy. But contrary to conventional wisdom, this has never had much to do with America's own energy demand. The United States came out of World War II self-sufficient in oil. Indeed, the United States had provided most of the oil that its allies had used, and the United States would not become a net oil importer for nearly another 30 years until the 1970s. But coming out of World War II, American political elites deemed the relatively cheap, reliable flow of Persian Gulf oil as critical to the economic recovery of Europe and Japan, which in turn was deemed essential to America's own long-term economic prospects and to bind Europe, to bind Japan to the United States for their very economic and overall security. Though the United States became an oil importer, net oil importer, in the 1970s, and its own energy security became more tied to the Persian Gulf, the United States has never has never used Middle Eastern supply to meet the bulk of its own oil demand. Instead, American political elites have found it vital to quote unquote secure Middle Eastern oil, not really for America's own need, but to control the flow of oil to the global economy, which depends so heavily on it, in order to reinforce America's strategic influence in important parts of the world. So no matter how significant today's shale revolution turns out to be, it will not attenuate America's determination for dispositive strategic influence over the Middle East's hydrocarbons. To have dispositive influence over the Middle East hydrocarbons, its oil and gas, the United States has deemed it necessary to dominate the Middle East, to subordinate the strategic and political orientation of Middle East states to American preferences in order to consolidate a pro-American regional security order. But the major obstacle to realizing America's hegemonic ambitions has been the prospective emergence of truly independent power centers in the Middle East. Which is why for more than 60 years, America has worked assiduously to suppress the emergence of independent power centers in the Middle East. And throughout, Iran has been central to this effort. In one of the first episodes of the Cold War, the United States pushed hard in 1946 for the Soviets to withdraw their forces from Iran. And though the United States succeeded in pushing the Soviets to withdraw their forces from Iran, and Iranians elected a government under the staunchly anti-socialist Mohammad Mossadegh, the United States could not accept Iran's determination for independence, especially as embodied in Mossadegh's commitment to reclaim Iranian oil for Iranians. So the CIA in 1953 launched a coup to reinstall a Shah who would be beholden to the United States. And for decades, Iran became a crucial American collaborator in the Persian Gulf, effectively policing the Persian Gulf in accordance with American preferences. Likewise, the United States has been sharply antagonistic to the emergence of strong independent Arab governments that might challenge the legitimacy of Saudi Arabia and other American proxies over Middle Eastern oil. Which is why, though the United States was initially open in the 1950s to Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had banned the Communist Party and stood up to America's rival, the British, the United States turned against Nasser when he challenged Saudi Arabia over what he called Arab oil. He said it wasn't Saudi oil, it was Arab oil. And then he had the gall to recognize the People's Republic of China and to work with India to establish the non-aligned movement. The United States remained hostile to Egypt even after Nasser died in 1970 and his successor, Anwar Sadat, expelled Soviet advisors from Egypt in 1972. The United States would not embrace Egypt until Sadat fully capitulated to Washington's vision of regional order in 1978 with the Camp David Accords. The so-called special relationship itself between the United States and Israel should be understood and examined through this prism of America's hegemonic ambitions in the Middle East. For it was only after the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, when Israel demonstrated that it could unilaterally attack, seize, and hold territory in Soviet-aligned Arab states, Egypt and Syria, and beat back the Soviet Union's other Middle Eastern ally, Iraq, that the United States began providing top-of-the-line weapon systems and substantial military and economic aid to Israel. American administrations didn't do this because Israel became more democratic after 1967. It was just the opposite, as millions of Palestinians fell under Israeli occupation with no rights. Or because somehow memories of the Holocaust became more vivid decades after the fact. They also did not do it because of the Israel lobby, which was much weaker then than it is today. US policymakers did it because they came to believe that a militarily strong Israel, which could keep Arab states strategically subordinated, was useful for America's own hegemonic ambitions in the Middle East. It is the ability of Israeli governments and the Israel lobby to attach Israel's drive for military dominance over its neighbors to America's own quest for regional hegemony that has made the Israel lobby the powerful force in American domestic politics that it is today. But during the Cold War, the United States was still constrained in its drive for all-out hegemony in the Middle East by the Soviet Union and its allies in the region. For example, after the United States strategically lost Iran in 1979 and was subjected to the humiliating seizure of its diplomats, the most the United States did in response during the 1980s, while the Cold War was still there, was to collaborate with Israel to prosecute a proxy war against Iran in Lebanon and to support Saddam Hussein in his war of aggression against the Islamic Republic. But by the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union's impending collapse left the United States effectively unconstrained in consolidating a highly militarized pro-American political and security order in the Middle East, an order in which regional powers would be contained, if not overthrown, with overwhelming US military force if they could not be readily co-opted, like Egypt under Sadat and Mubarak. In 1980, concerned by Iraq's emerging independence, the United States was able to take advantage of Soviet weakness and Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait to deploy more than 500,000 US troops to the Middle East, not just to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait, but to lay the ground for a highly militarized pro-American regional order. This is why after the United States expelled Iraqi forces from Kuwait and destroyed Iraq's ability to project power beyond its borders, the United States did three interconnected things that it could not do during the Cold War to pursue all-out hegemony in the Middle East. First, it kept tens of thousands of American troops in the Persian Gulf on an open-ended basis. And it then reactivated the Fifth Fleet. After that war, we reactivated the Fifth Fleet, which had been deactivated following World War II, and we based it in Bahrain as a dedicated naval force for the Persian Gulf. Second, we imposed crippling sanctions on Iraq, killing 1 million people, half of them children. Third, we convened the so-called Middle East peace process to bring weakened Arab states into strategically subordinated settlements with Israel to align with the United States in its quote-unquote New World Order against any would-be challenger, the strongest of which was the Islamic Republic of Iran. This determination to dominate the broader Middle East became even more acute following 9/11, with the US invasions and prolonged occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq that have killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, and by helping Israel consolidate a nearly absolute freedom of unilateral military initiative in its neighborhood. Throughout, the most sustained challenge to America's highly militarized pursuit of dominance in the Middle East has been the Islamic Republic of Iran, the uniquely Islamist and fiercely independent political order created out of the 1979 revolution. But the Islamic Republic has not been implacably anti-American. It has tried to work with the United States in the post-Cold War era by adopting helpful neutrality to the United States during the 1991 war with Iraq, by helping the United States get its hostages out of Lebanon, helping the United States get weapons to Muslims in Bosnia, offering an American energy company the first contract to come back into Iran after the revolution, and helping the United States overthrow the Taliban and expel al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. But at each point, the US has refused to countenance a Middle East security order that would have an independent Iran, and instead designated Iran as part of the axis of evil, launched economic and cyber warfare against it, and dramatically increased its militarization of Persian Gulf states and Israel, all ostensibly to disarm Iran of weapons of mass destruction it does not have. This intensification of America's imperial ambitions in the Middle East, pursued with little regard for on-the-ground reality, has proven not just quixotic, but deeply damaging to America's strategic position. America's failures in Afghanistan and Iraq have proven not to just be costly drains of human and material resources. They've underscored for the world, and especially Middle Eastern publics, the limits of what American military might can accomplish. Even more importantly, the imperial thrust of American policy has decimated the perceived legitimacy of American purposes for the vast majority of Middle Eastern publics. 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, that might not have seemed so significant. But today, with Middle Eastern publics becoming more politically engaged and their opinions mattering more than ever, this is strategically devastating for the United States. It is also a real opportunity for the Islamic Republic of Iran. Flint and I argue that America's posture of unremitting hostility to the Islamic Republic has been the most self-damaging aspect of America's imperial turn in the Middle East. For rather than succumbing to sustained American hostility, the Islamic Republic has not just survived, but it has emerged over the past decade as the biggest beneficiary of America's ongoing decline in the Middle East. Flint will now tell us why this is the case, and I'm happy to turn it to him at this point.
Assalamu alaikum. The Islamic Republic has emerged as the biggest beneficiary of the United States' ongoing decline in the Middle East because by pursuing a foreign policy that actually appeals to regional publics, Tehran has positioned itself to take advantage of America's imperial hubris and policy mistakes to improve its own position. In going to Tehran, we draw on, at this point, literally years of opportunities to sit and listen to Iranian diplomats, national security officials, and politicians explain that strategy. On a map, one sees that Iran today shares land and maritime boundaries with 15 states. None is a natural ally of the Islamic Republic. In fact, nearly all have been hostile to the idea of an Islamic Republic in Iran. Several have been more than just hostile. The Islamic Republic's eastern neighbor, Afghanistan, under the Taliban, stormed the Iranian consulate in Mazar-e-Sharif, killing Iranian diplomats there, while the Islamic Republic's western neighbor, Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, with help from Iran's other Arab neighbors and from the United States, invaded it, killing 300,000 of its citizens during an 8-year war of aggression. Today, many of those same Arab neighbors host thousands of U.S. troops and billions of dollars of the deadliest U.S. weapons systems, all poised and threatening to attack the Islamic Republic. To deal with these security challenges, the Islamic Republic has developed conventional and asymmetric defensive capabilities, but it has virtually no capacity to project military power offensively beyond its borders. The real key to Iran's foreign policy gains has been what Hillary and I call its soft power strategy. Soft power is political science speak for the ability to get others to want what you want rather than coercing them to do what you want through hard military or economic power. One of the remarkable things about the shift in the Middle East balance of power over the last decade or so is that it has virtually nothing to do with Tehran's use of military force or economic coercion. Unlike the United States, the Islamic Republic hasn't invaded anybody or sanctioned anybody. It's much more about the Islamic Republic's soft power. Remember what Hillary said about the intensifying mobilization of Middle Eastern publics and the growing importance of public opinion in determining on-the-ground political outcomes. In this setting, Iran is pursuing a strategy that galvanizes regional publics' most intensely felt grievances, including grievances against the United States and Israel, and against their own unrepresentative regimes that cooperate in various ways with the United States and Israel. Iran, in effect, aligns itself with these publics and with public opinion itself to constrain hostile, unrepresentative, pro-Western neighboring governments from working with the United States to attack it. Over the years, Iran has reinforced its soft power strategy by picking political winners as its allies in key regional arenas. Think of Hamas, Hezbollah, Iraqi Shia groups, today even Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood. Tehran's bet on these movements has paid off big time as they have become the most influential political players in the Middle East today. Now, Washington dismisses much of this as Iranian quote-unquote support for terrorism. But with all due respect for the paramilitary capabilities of Iranian-supported groups resisting Israeli occupation or resisting violent jihadi elements like al-Qaeda and the Taliban, the most interesting thing about these groups is that when given the chance, they win elections. And they win for the right reasons, because they authentically represent unavoidable constituencies with real and legitimate grievances. When the United States refuses to deal with these groups by calling them terrorist organizations, it reduces even further its own chances of constructively influencing regional developments and opens up even more political space for Iran. This is just one of many ways in which America's unwillingness to deal with the Islamic Republic as an independent power center undermines the legitimacy and efficacy of U.S. policy. Such obtuseness is also evident in Washington's approach to the Iranian nuclear issue. The United States and a handful of Western countries which share its position on the issue, Britain, France, Israel, that's it, they aren't asking Iran not to build nuclear weapons because the Islamic Republic isn't building nuclear weapons, as even U.S. and Israeli intelligence agencies acknowledge. Rather, the United States and these three other countries are trying to force Iran to surrender something it is perfectly entitled to do as a sovereign state and as a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that is, to enrich uranium under international safeguards. They are demanding, with no basis in international law or legitimacy, that Iran surrender the right to an indigenous nuclear fuel cycle, and Tehran won't do it. That's what the nuclear issue is really all about. If the United States accepted the principle and reality of safeguarded enrichment in Iran, it could have a nuclear deal within weeks. Iran would ratify and implement the additional protocol to the NPT, which provides for expanded and more proactive monitoring of signatories' nuclear activities, and accept other more intrusive verification and notification instruments. But the United States won't do this because it would mean accepting the Islamic Republic as an independent power center in the Middle East. And so the controversy drags on. This puts the Islamic Republic in the position of pursuing its nuclear rights in defiance of the United States and Israel, something that has powerful resonance with publics across the Middle East, indeed throughout the global South. Some Arab leaders may not like the Iranian nuclear program, but polls of predominantly Sunni Arab populations show large majorities strongly supportive of Iran's nuclear efforts. Some even show large majorities of Arabs thinking it would be a good thing if Iran acquired nuclear weapons. And that brings us back to Iran's soft power strategy, getting people to want what you want. In strategic terms, the Islamic Republic is using, through its narrative, not its drones or its tanks or even its centrifuges, but through its narrative, the political awakening of Middle Eastern publics to alter the very nature of power politics in the Middle East. The Middle East balance of power is becoming, in effect, a balance of influence. progressively less defined by hard military capabilities where the United States has clear advantages and the Islamic Republic is deficient, and ever more defined in terms of who can appeal to regional publics where the Islamic Republic has real advantages. Tehran is both encouraging and taking advantage of this transition to enhance its own regional standing. Another important respect in which the United States has gone wrong in its Iran policy is its refusal to understand that only an Islamic Republic of Iran can accrue the kinds of soft power gains I'm talking about. The Shah couldn't have done it. A pro-Western secular Republic of Iran couldn't have done it. Only the Islamic Republic of Iran can do it. Instead of recognizing this, American political policy media elites persist in depicting the Islamic Republic as an illegitimate system so despised by its own population that it's in imminent danger of overthrow. American elites have been saying this for more than 30 years, virtually since the Islamic Republic's founding out of the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And for more than 30 years, the Islamic Republic has consistently defied their relentless predictions of its collapse or defeat. The Islamic Republic has survived because its basic model, the integration of participatory politics and elections with principles and institutions of Islamic governance and a strong commitment to foreign policy independence, this model is, according to polls, electoral participation rates, and other indicators, it is in actual fact what a majority of Iranians living inside their country want. They don't want a political order grounded in Western-style secular liberalism. They want an indigenously generated order reflecting their cultural and religious values. As the reformist President Mohammad Khatami described them, freedom, independence, and progress within the context of both religiosity and national identity. That's what the Islamic Republic, with all its flaws, offers Iranians the chance to pursue. Even those Iranians who want the Islamic Republic to evolve in significant ways, at the end of the day, even most of them still want it to be the Islamic Republic of Iran. And it's not just a substantial percentage of Iranians who seem to think this way. In every Muslim society in the Middle East, where people have had the opportunity to choose their political futures through elections, clear majorities have voted for some version of what the Islamic Republic has been trying to do since the Iranian Revolution. And the Islamic Republic has made progress in some impressive ways. Contrary to deeply rooted but ill-informed Western stereotypes, the Islamic Republic has achieved far more progressive outcomes in alleviating poverty, delivering health care, providing educational access, and yes, expanding opportunities for women than the Shah's regime ever did. Certainly, the Islamic Republic has achieved more progressive outcomes in these areas than any of its neighbors, including US allies like Saudi Arabia and Turkey. These realities never seem to count when Americans and expatriate Iranians engage in self-gratifying criticism of human rights conditions in the Islamic Republic, but they matter greatly in legitimating the Islamic Republic for most Iranians living in their country. Notwithstanding the Islamic Republic's staying power, foreign policy pundits who in many cases have no direct connection to on-the-ground reality inside Iran continue telling us that the system there is on the verge of collapse. The basic features of this storyline stay the same, whether it's reflected in claims that the 2009 presidential election was a fraud, that the Green Movement, which emerged in the aftermath of that election, represented something more than a narrow and alienated elite stratum of Iranian society, that sanctions are now finally working to undermine the Islamic Republic's basic stability, or that in the context of the Arab awakening, the same social currents empowering Islamists across the Arab world will, in Iran, somehow transform the Islamic Republic into a secular liberal democracy. Every time and in every form, the story proves false. But foreign policy pundits who know nothing about Iran, Iranian expatriates who fled the revolution and want the Islamic Republic to fail, and pro-Israel advocates keep peddling it. What all of this constantly getting Iran wrong reflects is a delusion that the United States is still basically in control of the strategic situation in the Middle East. This is a dangerous delusion, grounded in persistent American illusions about Middle Eastern reality. Here's reality. Because of failed wars and occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan, a war on terror that has turned Muslim societies ever more firmly against US policy, and de facto support for open-ended Israeli occupation of Arab populations, America's position in the Middle East is in free fall. If, with regional publics increasingly mobilized, the United States launches another war to disarm yet another Middle Eastern country of weapons of mass destruction it does not have, the damage inflicted on America's position in the Middle East and globally will make that inflicted by the decision to invade Iraq look almost trivial by comparison. For its own interests, Washington has to take a different approach. The United States needs to come to terms with the Islamic Republic, not as a favor to Tehran, but to save its own position in the region and avert the strategic and moral catastrophe of another Middle Eastern war. Coming to terms with the Islamic Republic means accepting it as a legitimate order representing legitimate national interests and as a rising regional power unwilling to subordinate its foreign policy to Washington. There is an important precedent in recent American history for the kind of diplomacy I'm talking about. Accepting a rising regional power as a legitimate entity pursuing its interests in a fundamentally rational and defensive way is how President Richard Nixon enabled the historic opening to China in the early 1970s. For 20 years, from the time of the Chinese Revolution, the United States had worked to isolate and undermine the People's Republic of China. Washington didn't just pursue a regime change policy toward the People's Republic, it recognized a whole other political structure based on Taiwan as the quote-unquote real government of China. And the results were terrible for the United States. Trying not to contain but to suppress and undermine China ended up undermining the US position in Asia and took America into the Vietnam War. In this context, Nixon recognized the imperative of rapprochement with Beijing. His initiative to realign relations with China saved America's position in Asia after the draining disaster of Vietnam. If the United States accepted the Islamic Republic in the same way, an equally thorough realignment of US-Iranian relations would be possible. Ayatollah Khamenei and the 3 Iranian presidents elected over the course of Khamenei's 23-year tenure as supreme leader have all said repeatedly that Iran is open to better relations with America, but only on the basis of mutual respect, equality, and American acceptance of the Islamic Republic. Mutual respect, equality, and American acceptance. If Washington wants to get its Iran policy right, that's a pretty good roadmap. Thank you very much.
Well, the most important thing I can say tonight is actually very brief. 3 words. Read this book. That's good advice. You'll find a lot of information that's not generally available, some that's not available at all. Also, very valuable insights and understanding, which is sharply different from views in the United States, attitudes in the United States that are so conventional and unchallenged that they can fairly be called a party line, and also perspectives that may help, if they're widely enough understood, to halt a very clear drift towards what could be a terrible war, and perhaps not far in the future. That's actually anticipated. Last December, there was a conference in New York of the Washington Institute of Near East Policy. It's actually an offshoot of AIPAC, but the press pretends not to notice that when they cite them as a major source. The conference was attended by high officials of with regard to the Middle East of the last two administrations, Martin Indyk, Dennis Ross, Elliott Abrams. And according to press reports, they concluded, apparently happily, that there are a few months left for possible negotiations, and after that we'll have to go to war. And that could happen. This drift towards war, it's understandable if you pay attention to the party line. So if you followed, say, the last presidential debate, final debate of the last pre-election, the two candidates, Obama and Romney, agreed that the gravest threat to peace in the region is Iran. And the press dutifully reported the next day, not that they said it, but that the gravest threat to peace is Iran. If you follow the Hagel hearings shortly after, two countries were named, and Hagel was denounced by the Republicans for not his position on them. One was Israel. He was apparently not sufficiently worshipful of Israel. And the second was Iran, namely he wasn't eager enough to go to war with Iran. Practically no other country was mentioned. All of this raises a number of questions, three simple questions, in fact. First of all, who believes that Iran is the gravest threat to world peace? Two, what is the perceived threat? And three, assuming that there is a threat, is there a way to deal with it? Well, let's take a look. Hillary already answered the first. Who perceives that Iran is a threat? The United States, a few of its allies. It's a Western obsession, not the non-aligned countries. Most of the world, they have vigorously supported Iran's right to enrich uranium as a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They elected Iran as the head of the non-aligned countries right now in a meeting, ran the meeting in Tehran last August, and not the Arab world, as Flint pointed out, right nearby. They do see threats in the Arab world, mainly Israel and the United States. In several countries, Egypt and Iraq and a couple of others, the United States is seen as the greatest threat to the Arab world. In fact, about 2/3 in the most recent poll think that Israel's possession of nuclear weapons justifies other nations developing them. You read here that the Arabs support the U.S. on Iran. And that's not totally false, but you have to recognize how another U.S. party line, the reference to Arabs refers to Arab dictators. We don't care what the population thinks. And the dictators more or less support the United States. So that justifies the headlines, Arabs support the United States. If the population happens to think the U.S. is the greatest threat, well, it's just uninteresting people, unpeople, as George Orwell referred to them. People, in other words. It's typical of the contempt for democracy that's another part of the fundamental party line, concealed in misleading rhetoric. So that's who thinks Iran is a threat. What is the threat supposed to be? Well, actually, here we have authoritative answers. They come from the highest level, U.S. intelligence, the Pentagon. They give regular presentations to Congress on global security situation. It's all public. You can pick it up on the internet. It doesn't get reported. And they explain, of course, they talk about Iran as the Iranian threat. And they point out that the threat is not military. Iran has very low military spending, even by the standards of the region, of course, minuscule as compared to the United States. It has a strategic doctrine which is defensive, designed to deter invasion long enough for diplomacy to set in. And they say that if Iran is developing nuclear weapons, for which they have no evidence, but if it is, it would be part of their deterrent strategy. And that's crucial. The U.S. cannot tolerate a deterrent strategy. Israel, incidentally, is exactly the same. You read a couple of weeks ago that Israel bombed military sites in Syria, and the reason that was presented was because they might help a deterrent to Israeli attack on Lebanon. Namely, they might go to the only force that deters an attack, Hezbollah. And states, which are technically called rogue states, that believe they have the right to use force freely everywhere, cannot tolerate deterrence for obvious reasons. That's what the threat is. Is there any way to deal with it? Well, there are actually a couple of ways. There are some efforts in the past that would have succeeded if the U.S. hadn't blocked them. If there's time, I'd go into it. Actually, they discuss it in their book. But there's a more far-reaching proposal, which is an important one. In fact, it came up at the non-aligned meeting in Tehran last August. They renewed a proposal that's quite old and has been advanced most strongly by the Arab states, primarily by Egypt, and that is to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. That has overwhelming support, such strong support that the United States has been compelled to formally agree, but with qualifications, not now, sometime in the future, and must exclude Israel. Well, that's not going to get anywhere. Is there any way to pursue this project? Yeah, very definite ways. In fact, we just passed a milestone and could have exploited it if there were any interest in solving the greatest threat to peace. Last December, there was to be a meeting under international auspices of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in Helsinki, Finland, to try to move forward towards establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone, actually a weapons of mass destruction-free zone. Israel said it wouldn't attend the conference. Everyone was waiting to see what Iran would say. In early November, Iran said it would attend the conference. A couple of days later, Obama canceled the conference. The European Union the European Parliament proceeded to pass a strong resolution calling for carrying the process forward anyway. The Arab states said they would pursue it, but if Washington blocks it, then it's not going to get anywhere. There's only one way to change this, and that's American citizens, American public opinion could change U.S. policy, but there's a precondition. They have to know something about it. They have to know that it exists. And in this case, you can't know that it exists unless you carry out your own research projects or read arms control journals, arcane journals. There wasn't a word about it in the American press. All of this passed without a word. It was shortly after this that the Washington Institute for Near East Policy meeting that I mentioned took place. They doubtless knew about it and now could happily move on to war. So there are things that can be done. Those are the three main questions. There's another point that should be recognized. It's come up in both of the previous discussions. It's now 60 years since the U.S. overthrew the parliamentary government in Iran. And since that time, not a single day has passed in which the U.S. hasn't been torturing Iran constantly. Jimmy Carter was asked about this, and he said, well, it really didn't matter, it's ancient history. Obama's standard line is, let's not look to the past, let's look to the future. That's a very convenient position for criminals. Let's forget about everything that happened. But it's not somehow victims don't feel that way. They have memories. You see this all over the world. The victims have memories which the perpetrators don't know about and like to forget because it's all in the past. Let's forget it. Actually, it's useful to remember a quip of William Faulkner's. He said, the past is never dead. It's not even past. And that's true in this case. For the victims, the past is not past. So first came the overthrow of the parliamentary regime. Actually, we now have for the first time a really kind of definitive scholarly study of what happens, very much worth reading. Ervan's Abrahamian's new book called The Coup, scholar at Columbia, Iranian-American scholar. He makes a pretty convincing case, very convincing, that the reasons that were offered at the time and that have been maintained in scholarship are just not correct. It had nothing to do with the Russians. It didn't even have anything to do with profits. It had to do with control over the oil, and control for a good reason. It was necessary to prevent what's sometimes called the domino effect, the effect on others if a country gains control of its own energy. And they were very concerned at the time, particularly with Egypt. Egypt was right in the process of throwing out the British, and there were big demonstrations in Egypt about the overthrow, the coup, and so on. And they were concerned that the Americans were rightly concerned that if Iran could gain control of its own resources, Egypt might be impelled to do so as well. And after that, in the official terminology, the rot might spread elsewhere, the rot of independent development that's not tolerable for rogue states that expect to dominate the world. And the US media actually grasped the essential point in an interesting way. So here's the New York Times right after the coup. They praised the coup, so it was a great idea. Underdeveloped countries with rich resources now have an object lesson in the heavy cost that must be paid by one of their number, which goes berserk with fanatical nationalism. It's perhaps too much to hope that Iran's experience will prevent the rise of Mossadegh, the nationalist leader, in other countries, but that experience may at least strengthen the hands of more reasonable and more far-seeing leaders who will have a clear-eyed understanding of the principles of decent behavior, which means do what we say or else. That's decent behavior, and understood. New York Times is accurate. Well, the torture continued all through the period of the Shah. It had one of the worst human rights records in the world. The U.S. strongly supported him. Actually, there's an MIT connection that some of you may remember. Those of you who were around in the 70s will recall that the campus practically blew up when an arrangement, was supposed to be a secret arrangement, leaked, showing that MIT was, to exaggerate slightly, effectively selling the nuclear engineering department to the Shah, admitting Iranian nuclear engineers in return for some unknown amount of largesse. We never found out the money. The students were strongly opposed. There was a big student uprising. I think about 80% of the students were opposed in a referendum. It went through. It was strongly supported. It was actually under Washington's initiative. The initiators were familiar people, Henry Kissinger, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld. They thought the Shah needed nuclear power, and of course, means to develop nuclear weapons if necessary. And it went through, and it has consequences. The current Iranian nuclear energy program is run by PhDs from MIT, so we contributed to the gravest threat to world peace. Then comes the fall of the Shah. The U.S. immediately turned to support for the Iraqi invasion, strong support. Ronald Reagan removed Saddam Hussein from the terrorist list so that the United States could provide him with direct aid and support, other Western powers too, and the support was really strong. In fact, Saddam Hussein was granted a privilege that otherwise only Israel has had, namely to attack a U.S. ship and kill several dozen crewmen, USS Stark, and to get away with it without even a comment. That shows real love. Shortly after that, U.S. forces pretty much entered the war directly, making sure that Iraqi ships could get through the Gulf. U.S. warship shot down an Iranian airliner in its domestic airspace. There wasn't any question about it. The USS Vincennes killed 290 people, a civilian airliner. The commander of the ship right next to it, David Carlson, actually wrote an article in the official naval journal about it, coming very close to saying this just had to be deliberate. He said they kind of watched with amazement as the Vincennes trained its advanced Aegis missiles on this plane in domestic airspace and shot it down. Well, the U.S. reaction was to provide the medals of honor to the flight officer who shot the plane down and the commander of the ship. George Bush, then vice president, said that he was asked whether the U.S. ought to apologize. He says, no, I will never apologize for anything the United States does, whatever the facts are. Well, you know, the Iranians with their strange memories probably remember all of this. Immediately afterwards, Bush, then president, showed his love for Saddam Hussein by inviting Iranian nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in nuclear weapons production. That's the country that had killed hundreds of thousands of Iranians during a US-backed attack. And meanwhile, Iran was subject to sanctions, harsher and harsher sanctions. That continues, and now it's threats of war. The phrase, all options are open, has a meaning. It means the option of attack, military attack is open. For those of you who have kind of antiquarian interests, there's something called the UN Charter, you know, way back there, which is the foundation of modern international law, but not for rogue states. And its first principle is that outlawing the threat or use of force in international affairs. What you hear daily from the White House and others, threat of force, Israel, of course. Well, there's, among other things, along with reading this book, I'd suggest you look up something else, which you can pick up on the internet. It's a very interesting lecture at Chatham House. That's Britain's counterpart to the Center for Foreign Relations. It's by John Snow, this leading British journalist, very important journalist, and a very good one, who has a lot of experience with Iran. It's a lecture on Iran to Chatham House. You can find it on the internet. And his main point is that the West, he takes pretty much the same view as Hillary and Flint. He says the West must overcome its contempt for Iran and its people. The West should, he's talking mostly to the British, they must engage with Iran. with trade, with cultural interchange. And he brings up a highly successful example of this, cooperative effort of the British Museum and Iran on cultural exchanges. British Museum has lots of great Iranian art, which somehow found its way there by means unmentioned. And there were exchanges over it, which worked very well. And another example came up right here a couple of months ago. Many of you may know that the AAAS had its annual meeting, American Association for Advancement of Science, here in Boston. And one of the panels was an interesting one that speakers in one of the panels had just attended an international conference in Tehran. It was a conference on HIV/AIDS. And at the panel here, they described Iran as a model for the rest of the region in its response to AIDS, and added that we can learn a lot from what Iranians are doing, but they also added that Iran's efforts are now being severely hampered by the harsh sanctions, one of the points of them. Well, John Snow ended his talk with the words, esteem, esteem, esteem. He said we should respect Iran, its history, its civilization, while making clear whatever we think about its government. And I think I might just add that we might have the honesty, conceivably, to look in the mirror, learn something about ourselves. And if we do, we can avert the dangerous drift to war, and we can hope to settle existing conflicts such as they are peacefully. Thanks.
Very good,
Well,
thanks.
we have about half an hour for your questions and responses from the panelists. In view of the time that we have only half an hour, may I request that you make your questions as brief as possible and direct them to one or another of the speakers, and introduce yourselves first, and then raise your question. Yes, please.
Yes, my name is Ken Oy, and I teach political science and engineering systems here at MIT. My question is to Flint and Hillary. You've done a beautiful job of describing a bipartisan U.S. policy of unrelenting hostility towards the Islamic Republic. My question centers on your assessment of the preconditions for change in that policy. You've sat inside and witnessed the arguments. You've been doing your book tours, trying to influence opinion. You're also astute observers of the Middle East, with sensitivity to potential changes in Iran itself and throughout the region. Nixon went to China, as you point out. Policies do change. What will it take for U.S. policy to change on Iran?
Wow. I think that Professor Chomsky touched on something very important. Nixon's effort to realign U.S. relations with China was very much a top-down effort. It was led from within the executive branch. Indeed, probably for most of the period that the ground was being laid, I think probably not more than 10 people in the U.S. government knew what was really going on. And the Secretary of State was not always one of those 10 people. And the calculation was that this was going to be so domestically challenging to do that you almost had to lay the groundwork in secret, kind of spring this achievement on the world, on the public, and count on the public responding in a favorable way so that those forces in American domestic politics who would try and subvert a realignment of relations with China would be put on the defensive and marginalized. And I think as a political strategy, that worked pretty well. for all that it reflected a certain Nixonian cynicism, it actually worked pretty well. I don't know if you can do that in a 24/7 news cycle wired world like we live in. I think it is going to take real presidential leadership. I wish I could say I was more optimistic about President Obama in this regard than I am, but I think it is going to ultimately take presidential leadership, but it is also going to take what Professor Chomsky talked about. It is going to have to take a greater mobilization of public opinion, public attitudes. I mean, you see it in the polls now that, I mean, varies depending on how you ask the question, but there is kind of a general war weariness among the American public right now. That can be manipulated, that could be turned around with a, clever propaganda, but it's also something that could be mobilized in another way. It could be mobilized in a way that could actually make it more possible to try and realign US relations with Iran. The obstacles you point to are all there, they're real, they're strong. I wish I could be more optimistic than I am, but we have to make the best argument that we can make.
And it's a reason why we call our new book Going to Tehran, because when we first started this, when we were working in the US government, we were working in the White House, we thought that the United States could do particular things. For example, it could stand down in some of the covert operations, the hundreds of millions of dollars that we've allocated for covert operations to undermine and overthrow the Islamic Republic. Or we could somehow decrease some of our aggressive patrolling of the Persian Gulf. But it gets to really what Professor Chomsky was getting at. How do you allow the United States, American citizens, to become more educated, to see Iran, the Islamic Republic, for what it is, what it's built, including its flaws, but what it's doing that makes it not just a power that has staying power, but that has real power for the region and the world. And that's why we say it's going to Tehran. It's going to Tehran intellectually, strategically, but physically. That the president today in the political system that we can't really lift sanctions, can't really stop the covert operations unless there is this leadership to show Americans that you can go to Tehran and you're not going to be hung in the square, that there are real people there doing real things. And that's why that's such an important driver in our book, going to Tehran intellectually, but physically. The president needs to do that.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is S.T. Hussain and I am from Pakistan. The majority of people in Pakistan are now facing the severe load shedding. And there is the Iran and Pakistan pipeline, which has been opposed by the American administration. That is adding the feeling in the general public against American that why they are not allowing that gas line or pipeline project to be completed.
It's, the case you raise is a very good example of an instrument that the United States uses more and more in dealing with Iran, so-called secondary sanctions. There are some UN sanctions, authorized by the Security Council against Iran. There are a lot of unilateral US sanctions that affect what US businesses, US individuals can do vis-a-vis Iran. But most of the sanctions that cause difficulties in Iran are there through what are called secondary sanctions, where the US threatens to punish a third country, not for what it's doing in the United States, but for doing perfectly lawful business, like wanting to have a natural gas pipeline, with Iran. These sanctions are almost certainly illegal under the World Trade Organization. Under the WTO, you have a national security clause where if you're at war with a country, you can truncate your trade relations with that country by invoking the national security clause. You don't have a right to punish third countries for what they do in another country, but that is now routinely what the United States does. And if, the United States ever sanctions too important a country under those secondary sanctions, I think there's a good chance the US will get taken to the World Trade Organization over it, and the United States will lose that case. This is illegal, what the United States is doing, and what they're trying to block Pakistan from doing is a good example of that.
I just add that the United States does this routinely.
Yeah.
It's been doing it with Cuba for 50 years.
That's right.
Against
That's right.
a unanimous world opposition. That's what it means to be a rogue state. You do what you like.
Yes, please go ahead.
Mr. and Mrs. Leverett, I haven't read the book, but from your statement about the main argument of the book, and from a critique I read about the book, I think you may be conflating two things. There are realities about life in Iran and about how people view the government. And there is also the US government taking advantage sometimes of those realities and using those realities for propaganda or for its own purposes, for its own benefit. I think that, for example, the Green Movement is a good example of that. The fact that there were millions of people on the street after the elections shows that there is a group of Iranians, and they may be the majority, but there are millions of Iranians who are opposing very main elements of the government, of the regime in Iran. And they're not in support of at least the current form of the government, the way, or the current order of power in the regime, in the current regime. But then there's also the United States government taking advantage of those realities. And it is true that the government did take advantage of what went on after the elections for its own agenda or for its own propaganda. But it's a very unfair representation of the realities of Iran and of the people of Iran to deny the way that Iranian people view their own government if it is to show what the U.S. government is, how the U.S. government is using those realities.
I mean, look, American governments have been doing this since 1953, as Professor Chomsky articulated. And there's a new book that goes through this very, very cogently about the coup. The United States has always taken advantage of disaffected people, particularly disaffected elites in Iran. So certainly, you go to North Tehran, where Mousavi won the majority won North Tehran clearly, and he won the majority of Tehran, not the province, but the city. Clearly, there are disaffected people there, like there are all over the world, and the United States does take advantage of them. The United States clearly tries to find expatriates and people within countries, disaffected people, to hold them up, whether it's Cuba, whether it's Iraq, whether it's China in the 1960s. We hold them up to say, see, these people need liberation. This is the American way of war, to liberate what I would call marginalized, narrow group of disaffected elite. Now, does that mean that they don't have a right to do whatever they want to do? All power to them. If they want to and they can mount a revolution to have a different political order, that's not my business. But if you look at public opinion polling, if you look at voter participation rates, not just for the presidency, the city council, for the parliament, they're very high. In Iran, people actually think their vote matters, which is a bit different than here. And contrary to all everything that we see in the media, that there's just going to be the supreme leader is going to just anoint the next presidential election in Iran is likely to be very interesting, very exciting, and highly contested, because as the political order inside the Islamic Republic has matured, it is independent, it is indigenous, it is far from perfect, but people contest outcomes. We have gone from about 32 years ago, every single Iranian being a royal subject. 32 years later, 100% of Iranians can vote. They can vote for council, they can vote for parliament, they can vote for president, they can vote for the assembly of experts that oversees the supreme leader. We went for a situation in Iran where 32 years ago there were very high literacy rates, especially for women, to today, for the people that have been educated by the Islamic Republic, literacy is 97% with no gender disparity between men and women. These are real outcomes. The University of Mississippi is going to Iran to try to figure out how Iranians could help them get healthcare delivery to the Mississippi Delta. These are real achievements. Of course there are disaffected people. Of course, our heart goes out to disaffected people everywhere to do what they can to have a better life. But Americans use that and try to manipulate that. Cuba, Iraq, China, and now Iran. There is no way that an independent country is going to negotiate their internal political order with a hostile power. No way.
If I may, I would like to insert a few comments here, taking advantage of my position. It seems to me that the arguments that all three of you have presented regarding American foreign policy have all been well taken based on premises with which I wholeheartedly agree. Against intervention, against imposition of American will on Iran or in the region, and so on. But I hope that that argument and that sentiment, as laudable as it is, does not lead to a distortion of the political realities inside of Iran. We are not talking about a few disaffected people in northern sections of Tehran. We are talking about a movement after the contested elections in particular that, according to the mayor of Tehran at the time, Ghalibaf, who is now a presidential candidate, brought out 2 to 3 million people in the streets of Tehran protesting the policies of the government and the manner in which the elections were held, that led to a brutal put down of that movement. We are talking about individuals with high-ranking positions whose commitment to the Islamic Republic was beyond question, namely the Prime Minister of Iran for 8 years during the Iran-Iraq War, Mir Hossein Mousavi, the 2-time Speaker of the Parliament, Karoubi, who have been under house arrest ever since the elections, with the government absolutely lying about its policies with regard to these individuals. We are talking about hundreds of individuals who are in prison, journalists, high officials of the government, human rights activists, attorneys who have defended those individuals who are in jail. These are realities. These need not be overlooked. These need not be, dismissed in favor of the arguments that you are making, with which I wholeheartedly agree, that concerns American foreign policy. You need not link these two things together. The realities in Iran speak for themselves, and it requires a knowledge of those realities on the ground to speak meaningfully about them.
That's, look, I'm not trying to, it's not my place to tell Iranians what their political future should be. My place as a political analyst is to try and understand what political reality is. Not what I might wish it to be, but what it is. And I think the two things that you want us to separate are inextricably linked. You talk about journalists imprisoned in Iran. Which country imprisons more journalists? The Islamic Republic of Iran or the US ally, NATO member, secular democratic Turkey? The answer is Turkey. Turkey imprisons more journalists than any country on the planet, including China, including Iran, including any other country you might want to name that the US has problems with. Okay? Now, I'm not saying don't care about journalists imprisoned in Iran or not care about journalists imprisoned in Turkey. I'm saying that if you let an uncontextualized focus on certain specific aspects of human rights in Iran, undercut American engagement. You can say all you want that you're opposed to war. You can say all you want that you're opposed to the United States trying to pursue coercive regime change in Iran. But if that's what you were doing, if every discussion about U.S. diplomacy toward Iran has to have the obligatory, but what about the Green Movement section, then you are undercutting prospects for better policy, and you are pushing the United States closer to war. You can say that's not what you want. You can say that's not what you're trying to do, but that is what you are doing.
And that's what's happened under President Obama, who ostensibly came in, who said we should engage. But that's what's happened, because he took Iranian expatriates, he invited them in, he asked them what their view was, even though they don't go to Iran, even though they don't take into account official objective data like voting statistics, what people actually care about, who they said they voted for before, after, and during the race. And he held that up and said, well, we can't engage. We have to first have a pause. We can't engage. And then we have to impose more sanctions. And then we have to send tens of billions of dollars in weapon systems to Saudi Arabia and Israel, just to be prepared in case we have to attack Iran. All of that happened under Obama. He took Bush's policies and increased them exponentially against Iran using the Green Movement.
Yes, please.
So, my question is in the same direction. So from one side, the Iranian nuclear plans is making Western country policies united towards Middle East and Iran. And then from one side, you are saying that the solution is behind American people votes to change the view of American policy towards Iran. And then from the other side is Iranian side that is kind of complex. It's not really clear. And again, they feel victims, so they prefer to be approached by American side. So the question is, given these two sides, which nobody is really moving towards each other, what can happen to united Iran and US and Western country again together?
I couldn't hear. Who was it directed to?
Was it directed to a particular person?
Dr. Chomsky.
Professor Chomsky.
I'm sorry.
It was a bit hard to hear the question.
So the question is, what can fix American policy point of view towards Middle East, briefly?
How can we have a different policy toward the Middle East? What
How
could
can
fix
we
them?
have a different?
Yeah, the United States.
Well, we can easily have a different policy toward the Middle East. So, for example, with regard to Iran, we can stop threatening war and do exactly what Hillary and Flint and Jon Snow suggested. Engage, have commercial and cultural relations, try to many ways to deal with whatever conflicts there are. For example, if someone thinks of the threat of nuclear weapons, there are many possibilities. I mean, I give narrower proposals, but the broadest proposal and the most sensible one is the one that most of the world wants, including the Arab states, including Iran, virtually everyone except the United States and Israel. And that's to move towards a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. And we can do that. Had a chance to do it last December. Wasn't reported, but there was a chance, and it can be done tomorrow. If the problem is, let's say, Israel-Palestine, which incidentally, of all the problems in the world, is probably the easiest one to solve. It's called intractable. It's not intractable. There is overwhelming support, virtually universal support, for a very straightforward solution to it. Actually, that solution was proposed at the UN Security Council in January 1976 by the three major Arab states, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. And it's now accepted by essentially everyone in the world. The proposal is to have a political settlement, diplomatic settlement, on the internationally recognized border, perhaps with minor and mutual adjustments. That's official U.S. wording, because it's a ceasefire line, so you straighten it out, with 2 states, each of them with guarantees of, I'm quoting, the right to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders, okay? Virtually universal support. The Arab states, the Organization of Islamic States, includes Iran, the non-aligned movement. There's one problem, right here. The U.S. vetoed the resolution, vetoed another similar one in 1980. Right up until today, it continues to block a diplomatic settlement. Well, okay, you can't have a diplomatic settlement if the biggest thug on the block says you can't have it. But that's something we can do something about. And look at the other problems. Well, we can look at them too. For example, if Egypt and Iraq, people in Egypt and Iraq believe, as they do, that the United States is the greatest threat they face, we could ask ourselves why. Why do Egyptians and Iraqis believe that the greatest threat they face is the United States? Maybe there's a reason for that. Well, yeah, there is a reason if we look, and we can do something about it. And the same with other problems. There are none that I know of that we can't do something about, often something decisive.
Thank you. Yes?
Hello, my name is Reza. I have a question for Hillary. Can you tell us more about the negotiation that took place in Afghanistan, like during the Afghanistan war, which are sometimes referred to as like a missed opportunity for like better relationships with Iran? Thank you.
Yes. So I had the opportunity I was a career foreign service officer in the State Department assigned to the U.S. mission to the United Nations in New York. And one of the things I had the chance to do there was to meet with, actually say hello to, an Iranian diplomat. The first time in studying and working on the Middle East in 20 years that I met and was allowed to say hello to and have a conversation with someone, an Iranian diplomat, an official who supported the Islamic Republic of Iran. That was something that I had not gotten in the US government. I hadn't gotten in any of the academic institutions in which I was educated, and certainly hadn't seen in any of the media. In those negotiations, well, the reason why we were allowed to do that, we were given an exception to talk to the Iranians as part of a multilateral mechanism about Afghanistan that was set up. It was the 6 countries surrounding Afghanistan, of which Iran is one of those 6, the United States and Russia. And we were allowed to meet together to talk not about bilateral relations, but about Afghanistan under the Taliban, a situation that both the United States and Iran saw as threatening. We were able to have these discussions, and they were basically civil, interesting, constructive, but not really going anywhere before 9/11. With the 9/11 attacks, that changed pretty significantly. We were all in New York. My sister actually was at the World Trade Center. She's fine, nothing happened to her, but she worked at World Trade Center at Building 7. And I got a call right after the planes hit the building from my Iranian counterpart, asking how was my sister. It was both an interesting negotiation politically, but then even personally to have that kind of outreach. But coming back to substance, which was what was really interesting and important, was this Iranian official was the most constructive person in the room out of all of the other diplomats from the 6 countries and Russia, was the most knowledgeable about Afghanistan, about the other countries in Central Asia, about the geopolitics of the region, and had really constructive ideas of how we can deal with a post-9/11 environment. The United States was just looking to bomb anywhere. We had no real plan for dealing with Afghanistan. We had no plan for dealing with al-Qaeda. There were tremendous divisions in Washington. And my Iranian counterpart said, well, you know what? We, the Iranians and the Indians and the Russians, have worked during this period of Taliban rule. We have worked to actually put together various Afghan groups, different ethnicities, people in Afghanistan, into something called the Northern Alliance. We've worked to give them money, feed them, clothe them, train them. There are about 15,000 of them. We will work with you. These are people on the ground. We will work with you, the United States, unconditionally to help go in, overthrow the Taliban, and rout al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. This was critically important because the United States not only, we didn't have a war plan, we couldn't have a war plan. There was no way to get American troops to Afghanistan with any kind of speed. So there's this idea that we've always had tens of thousands of troops, or nearly 100,000 troops like we have now in Afghanistan. That's not how we fought the war in the first year. We had about 2,500 US, mostly special forces people on the ground. The rest of it was air power from the United States and these 15,000 Afghan Northern Alliance people that the Iranians had helped put together. This was a very constructive, not just relationship, but negotiation and dialogue with between the United States and the Iranians. We came together then in Bonn, Germany, to put together the political part of the process. And there too, it was fascinating what I heard from the Iranian side. The United States continued to just be focused on the military. The Iranians were focused on the constitution, that Afghanistan had to have a constitution that empowered and gave representation to all of Afghanistan's ethnic groups. They were very firmly convinced that this was the way forward for Afghanistan. There needed to be some sort of built-in power sharing in the constitution so that everybody could come into the government and have a say in the future of Afghanistan. The United States didn't care that much about it, but we let the Iranians have their push this silly thing called democracy, voting, and constitutionalism for Afghanistan. We finally met at the end of this session in Bonn. We all came together. There was a new government stood up for Afghanistan with Karzai as the head. Iran was very, very constructive and helpful to the United States in trying to help see that there were figures that represented various ethnicities, but who wouldn't be too anti-American coming into this process. We stood together in Bonn, and then we went back to Afghanistan to coordinate this new government. A few weeks later, there was something called the Korean A. A ship that the United States said left from somewhere in Iran and somehow got through essentially the American controlled Suez Canal, which never let Iranian military shipping through before the overthrow of Mubarak. But somehow this ship got from Iran with 50 tons of weapons to go to Gaza, to give to Arafat, to use against the Israelis. Arafat, who the Iranians, who Ayatollah Khomeini had said was not just an idiot, but a traitor for how he dealt with the Palestinians, how he dealt with the Iraqis, how he dealt with the Iranians. But somehow the Iranians were giving him 50 tons of weapons going through Suez, which had never allowed Iranian shipping to go through, and essentially there was an American veto over it. Well, the Israelis interrogated the captain, so they said. And the captain said that he came from Iran and the weapons were from Iran to Arafat, 50 tons. And they displayed them for the media, which the media dutifully reported. Well, in the White House, David Frum, one of the speechwriters, said, this is really something we can connect to Iraq and North Korea. And therefore, the axis of evil was born. The axis of evil. Iran, didn't matter what they had done in Afghanistan, it didn't matter how much they had helped us, it didn't matter how constructive, how rational, how defensive they were in their foreign policy, national security strategy, because they had to have sent these 50 tons of weapons to Gaza to use against the Israelis. They should be designated as part of the axis of evil. This was a real lesson for me coming into in foreign policy. I've been working on it for 20 years, but to actually work with Iranians who are working constructively in defense of their own country, working with the United States, I realized that we can't just work with Iran in issue-specific areas, because every time, and we've gone back and we researched this for a book, every time, whether it was Lebanon, whether it was Bosnia, whether it was Afghanistan, every time the United States pockets what Iran does, and actually because we're embarrassed to have done business with them, we increase sanctions, we increase the threats, and we get closer and closer to conflict. The only real way is a comprehensive negotiation aimed at acceptance, not just trying to pocket concessions from the Iranians.
One last question, please. Okay, you have the honor. Yeah.
My name is Ashraf Khalifa. I'm a citizen of Syria, and I would like to say it's interesting that you call your book Going to Tehran. People of Syria and the Middle East have not only gone to Tehran, people have respected and even served Tehran, and all they saw in response was an outrageous war, bloody war that Iran is co-leading with other regional allies of Assad. And it's interesting that you think that going to Tehran will reveal anything different than the core values that are the bloody values that are being demonstrated on the streets of Syria right now, by the Islamic Revolution of Iran. I mean, Iran has not only supported Assad with weapons and money, they have actually sent troops to participate in the killing that's going on in Syria. And there has been a big shift in the last 2 years when 2 years ago people in the Middle East used to respect and like Iran, the Islamic version of Iran. Now Iran is actually the first enemy, is considered the first enemy of Sunnis, who are the majority in the Middle East. And I don't think, it's interesting that you think that going to Tehran, I'm finishing this,
sure.
that if the US goes to Tehran now, it would come any close to the support of Arabs. It's actually Arabs right now, especially in the Middle East, are so disappointed with the US that it's not helping bringing those in the Islamic Revolution of Tehran to justice. I mean, maybe you don't want to go to war with them, but at least help as a superpower, bring them to justice for after they revealed themselves and their core bloody values, the values of the Islamic Revolution of Tehran. Thank you.
Thank you.
Look,
Would you want to respond, maybe?
Well, maybe we can just encapsulate the question for Professor Chomsky.
Yeah.
The question seems to be that, that how can we say we should go to Tehran when Tehran is perpetrating a bloody war against Syrians, and that, in fact, will alienate the United States from the vast majority of Sunni Arabs?
Well, I don't agree with you that nobody should come to the United States, but that's what you're claiming. The United States is carrying out one of the worst terrorist wars in history, all over the region. People here talk about a drone as something that assassinates a targeted person. Well, that's murder, but it's much worse than that. If you walk down the street outside and you don't know whether 2 minutes from now a blast is going to occur across the street from you, killing somebody who's there and anybody who happens to be standing around. If you have to live with that constantly, you're terrorized. A drone is a terror weapon designed to terrorize villages, communities, and in fact, whole regions. It's the worst terrorist war going on anywhere. And that's only the beginning of it. But I don't think that because of that, nobody should come to the United States, whatever you think about Syria.
We would have loved to have more questions from the audience and responses from our distinguished panelists, but I'm told that we do need to
we'll be in the back for a little
end the session. But I do want to make one other point, and that is that the Leveretts have kindly agreed to sign copies of their book that received the highest recommendation from Professor Chomsky. So you're welcome to...
There's also Professor Chomsky's latest book out.
Yes, and Professor Chomsky's latest book is out there too. He was too modest to mention that.
Which also must be read.
Yes. So we invite you to stop by the tables and pick up copies of the book and have them signed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.